he described him as having eyes of remarkable beauty and expression, glowing like jewels in the ardour of his inspiration, but a fish-like mouth and large jaw, pointing not only to strength of will, but love of ease and indulgence. Hence the name Toby Tosspot.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Australian history lacks a lot of the bloodthirsty appeal of the French, Russian or even American revolutions. But this doesn't really mean it's boring. From the midst of the Bushman and the larrikin, Banjo Paterson's poetry calling for holy war, yes, that's right, and the characters of Federation, Australia's history can be just as fascinating as France's. In fact, while Australian history might lack castles and crowned heads of Europe, it offers up something better. Deadpan humour, outrageous contradictions, and the occasional football trainer injecting testicle soup into his players. And that is true. Joining me for a satirical take on Australia's story is historian and best-selling author David Hunt. Welcome to Afternoon Light, David.
Thank you very much, Georgina. And look, I'm just going to take issue with one thing you said.
Yes.
Yes, I'm satirical, but my histories are sort of meticulously researched, accurate stories about Australia's past. So history with humour, I think, is the way that I'd like to describe it.
Well, indeed, this isn't historical fiction. This isn't sort of a fiction with a sort of a loose affiliation with the history. You're
it's
writing.
Not 1066 and all that, no.
Yeah, you are writing genuine history books, but with a humorous take, which is important. We work with a lot of school students here at the Robert Menzies Institute and their teachers, wonderful people. And the tragedy of Australian history is that it is seen as boring and it's unpopular. Less than 1% of students here in Victoria take the Australian history subject at the VCE level, and it doesn't exist in any other state or territory. So we are dealing with, I think, a crisis and a tragedy. They love revolutions, but Australian history it's on life support, I think, and it needs an injection of something. And you've obviously had a stab at it with your Girt series.
Yeah, look, it's amazing. There have been numerous research studies by Anna Clark and other eminent people about the way that Australian history is picked up in school curricula and how staggeringly unpopular it is. The only problem with those reports is they're considered even more boring than the Australian history itself.
So no one bothers to read those reports because they're too boring.
So nobody bothers to read those reports.
No disrespect to Anna.
No offence to Anna. As an academic or somebody who is interested in academic papers, I think she writes absolutely beautifully. But when I was taught Australian history at school, it was basically convicts, explorers leaving little dotted lines on maps, sheep, gold, sheep, rum. Rum got a mention. I found that interesting. And then there was sheep and more sheep.
Ships, lots of ships. Yeah.
Lots of ships, lots of boats coming and going. And so that didn't resonate with me as a kid, and it doesn't resonate with most kids today. What I would say is that Australian history's got off to a bad start in Australia. I mean, it wasn't even recognised as appropriate to study Australian history in Australian universities until the 1920s, I think, was the first time there was an Australian history component for history students, and then it was one lecture tacked on at the back end of a semester's studies of British history. So selling the Australian history message, we've always been behind the eight ball, and that is such a crying shame because Australia has a unique history. It's an amazing social experiment. It's settled with a 7-to-1 male to female ratio by criminals. It was a public-private partnership where the government provided all sorts of services traditionally provided by the church or charities. So it was the first experiment in big government anywhere in the world. You have rum becoming the liquid currency of choice. And the amazing thing about Australian history is that within the space of a single human lifetime, from settlement, the people of Victoria and New South Wales had the highest standard of living anywhere in the world. And that's often put down in the way that Australian history is taught to, gold, wheat and sheep. Being able to take a huge amount of land without paying the locals a penny. But the real reason for Australia's success is the unlocking of human capital and the fact that if you were a poor person in Britain, you would stay a poor person, your children would stay poor, your grandchildren would stay poor, whilst coming to a new land, merit was able to shine. And so you have ex-convicts becoming some of the richest people in the Southern Hemisphere, holding important government posts, and that wouldn't have happened back in Britain. So it was the unleashing of human capital that was the real story of Australia's rise to have the highest standard of living and the highest wages anywhere in the world.
And that sort of proof of concept of meritocracy and equality, that societies that are based on those sort of basic factors actually can thrive. And
Absolutely. No, I wouldn't say that everybody was happy with the idea of meritocracy. And even somebody like Governor Lachlan Macquarie, who championed it, did so for largely pragmatic reasons. When the soldiers of the New South Wales Corps, the Rum Corps, as it's known, were shipped back to Britain, they'd occupied just about every important government post in the colony. So there was a talent drain, and looking for people to fill it, well, there weren't many free settlers at that stage, so he looked towards the most enterprising and able of the convicts. They joined the magistracy, held senior positions, and of course there was pushback from the exclusive faction, but that meritocracy was ingrained very early on in modern Australian history.
Just back to the problem we have with our own history. I do wonder if it's something in the Australian character that sort of downplays the miracle of Australia's history. I mean, the miracle of Indigenous survival in a very harsh landscape over millennia.
Absolutely.
That they were able to, they came from northern parts and were able to live here, and times of drought and flood, they moved around and were able to survive. And then, of course, the settlers coming in the late 18th, early 19th century, the pioneering, they are overcoming massive, massive challenges and creating an egalitarian society, a democratic society. And, of course, we'll talk about this, lots of flaws, lots of mistakes made. But it is still a miraculous story. And as you were saying before, David, a great social experiment, and a social experiment that ends up, here we are in 2025 with the 12th largest economy in the world, one of the richest societies in the world. We're highly educated. We're aid donor. We're a contributor in the international sphere. We have a really good international reputation as a good international citizen. All these things. The quality of life here is amazing, comparatively speaking. So this is all out of quite recent history in terms of white settlement, but built on the amazing sort of survivorship of Indigenous people too.
I think the lack of interest was originally part of the cultural cringe. If it came from Australia, it wasn't British and British was best. And I think that view survived really until the late 1960s. Since then, I think the observation you made earlier about people like revolutions. People want a bit of blood. They want, great battles. They like castles. And we didn't have that. And in the context of revolutions, if you have a look, and this is one thing I love about the Rum Rebellion in 1808, on the 20th anniversary of the settlement of the colony, 26th of January 1808, where the New South Wales Corps marched on Government House to depose William Bligh, it was a really unusual revolution. You don't have weapons drawn. You have the soldiers singing and playing musical instruments. When they marched through the gates of Government House, the only armed resistance comes in the small and determined form of Blythe's daughter, Mary Putland, who assaults the incoming soldiers with her parasol. So, the US have got the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, a Declaration of Independence, the American Revolutionary War. The French have got a king and a queen, their heads in buckets at the foot of the guillotine, and Russia has millions killed in bloody purges. And when we Australians do revolution, we have a bit of a sing-along and a crazy chick with a small paper umbrella. And I love that about Australian history. I want to be from the country that does revolution in such a half-assed way. But it lacks the grand narrative of some of the other revolutions that people find interesting. So I like some of the reasonableness in Australian history as well as some of the sheer mad bastardry that occurred as a result of Australia being peopled with criminals and, black sheep who were sent out here because they had major sort of gambling, drinking and social problems.
Well, we had a near coup, of course, in New South Wales when the Lang government was in power in the early 20th century. So, I mean, I always say that's the closest that Australia got to civil war between sort of the right-wing forces and the left-wing forces. But, of course,
With brute. Galloping around with his sword and cutting ribbon.
And then, of course, stopping Jack Lang from opening the new Sydney Harbour Bridge by cutting the ribbon before he got there. I mean, that was that's the revolutionary zeal of Australians. I'm going to get to the ribbon first.
Yeah, well, that's right. What is it? You get a blue ribbon for winning. Get to the ribbon first. Look, we've had a couple of other things that aren't revolutions in a military sense. We had Wexit in the early 1930s, where our sand-groping friends voted in a referendum to secede from Australia. And when people had a look at the Constitution, and this went, the British Privy Council had a bit of a peek, there are mechanisms for places to join the Commonwealth. There's no mechanism in our Constitution for people to say, bugger it, I've had enough and I want to secede. So Wexit failed spectacularly. And, of course, there was a referendum held in New South Wales where New England wanted to secede from New South Wales in the 1960s. The Queenslanders are always agitating to split Queensland into different states, with the North having its own, Bobcatter-esque style of government. But these things have all been done through the political process rather than people in the streets and bullets firing. The only time that we've really ever had bullets flying in the streets were during some of the mining strikes and shearers' strikes of the 1880s, where, the government did have soldiers who trained machine guns on protesting workers. And perhaps, you look at the Patrick Stevedore's case later on, there are some parallels, but obviously Alsatians and men with balaclavas aren't as bad as men with machine guns. So the revolutions in Australia that have involved violence tended to have focused around, labour issues rather than nationalist issues.
And I guess that's part of the story of Australia being the working man's paradise. That this is where the working man, the farmer, the bricklayer, the shopkeeper.
Farmers were considered a bit posh. More your shearer, your boundary rider, your local tradie. They didn't have high-vis vests in those days.
Oh, I guess fluoro yellow was kind of hard to...
Must have been hard to work out who was a tradie and who wasn't. But I think Karl Marx identified the Australian colonies as the most likely places where his dreamed of revolution would take place. Australia was the first place in the world to have a Labor Party, Queensland in the 1890s, and certainly the first place in the world to have a Labor government in the 1890s, although I think it lasted only 6 days. And certainly Australia, the first place in the world to have a national Labor government when Chris Watson came to power in the early 1900s.
Himself a bit of a curious cat.
Well, he's a curious cat because Chris Watson wasn't Chris Watson. His real name was Johann Tank, and he claimed to be from New Zealand, part of the British Commonwealth, when in fact he was from Peru. And
I think if I recall it, and we've done a podcast on him, so I know, and we've done a podcast on most Australian Prime Ministers, so I'm really stretching my memory here.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure he was born on a ship that was off the coast of, well, it wasn't Peru. I thought it was off the coast of Chile. But, you know.
It may have been Chile. His father was a South American sailor of some description.
Maybe that was it.
And his mother was.
But he certainly was in breach of the old Section 44.
Absolutely. And if you have a look at how many of the early Australian politicians failed we now regard as the citizenship test.
King O'Malley, surely. Yes. Another absolute.
He was a Canadian. He wasn't a Canadian. He was an American insurance salesman.
And a murderer.
Certainly he had a colourful past as the bishop, I think, of one of the Redskin Nation back in America. But you have lots of colourful Australian politicians. But I think Chris Watson takes the cake, as it was only after he died that people realised that Chris was actually Johan Tank.
Yeah, amazing. Well, you know, Australia was the country you could come to and completely reinvent yourself. So I guess all those stories sort of beg the question about the notion of an Australian as a larrikin. They're a bushman, and, you know, there's that sort of 19th century idea of a quintessential Australian. And you've written about what those terms actually mean. I mean, we sort of have a vague idea in 2025 what they mean, but what's sort of the etymology of these terms, and what did they start off as?
Well, look, I'll start with larrikins first, because the popular notion of a larrikin is, salt of the earth bloke, King G's blue singlet, probably wearing steel-capped boots, likes to drink a bit and a smoke. Paul Hogan, is what we associate, or what people of my age associate larrikinism with. The original larrikins were very, very different. There was no positive association with larrikinism back when the term first came to prominence in 1870. Larrikins were basically gangs of disaffected youth from the working classes. They were tuppenny capitalists who worked as, abattoir workers, boot blacks, bottle collectors, none of the sort of sexy sorts of jobs. They identified with the costermonger culture of British musical theatre, based on Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. There was actually an attempt in Britain at the time to ban people dressing like characters from Oliver Twist, because it was thought that it would encourage them to engage in thievery and general badness.
They'd all turn into Fagin, would they?
They'd all turn into flash or sharp dresses. And so what you have is the British musical culture deliberately adopts this look, and then that was picked up by the costermongers, your fruit and veg salesmen on the streets, who all wear, waistcoats, scarves, handkerchiefs, lots of pearl buttons, that sort of stuff. They looked like Oscar Wilde, basically. And in Australia, that was the look that the larrikins were going for. Based on costermonger culture, they adopted flash talk, the thieves' cant, and introduced a whole lot of words into the English language, like yob is a larrikin word, which is boy backwards.
Right. So I never knew that. Yobbo. Yobbo obviously is the sort of elongated version.
What we do is, we Australians, we love contracting words, and then we love extending them by adding an O on the end for reasons that you'll probably have to talk to a linguist about. It's a very odd thing. Yeah, let's contract a word, and then let's, I had a ciggy in the arvo with my garbo mate whilst eating avo toast. And my garbo mate's name is Davo. So not just Dave, but we're going to add an O onto the end of that too. But no, so the larrikins, they would gather on street corners. They'd have sing-offs and dance-offs. You know, if you think of the sort of craze in New York in the 80s of disaffected youths gathering on the streets and playing music and breakdancing, the larrikins were doing that in the late 1860s in Melbourne and the early 1870s in Sydney. And then they would commit various social outrages. They would smack the hats of people, flattening them. They would use saucy words, I think, as one of the newspapers described it.
Saucy words?
Yes, causing women folk to blush.
Probably faint on occasion.
Faint on occasion. But smelling salts were, of course, on hand. And they would engage in what would be described today as antisocial behaviour or petty crime. They were considered a nuisance. As time went on, when the gangs became more organised and there was an organised criminal element to larrikinism, when you have the sort of pushers and the 40s as they were known, they became to be seen in an even darker light. They were organised criminals, and my favourite larrikin gang, the most feared gang in Melbourne at the turn of the 20th century, was the Crutchy Push, a larrikin gang made exclusively of amputees. All but one of them were missing at least part of a leg. The other guy was missing half of his arm, and they would assault passers-by with their crutches. They'd break into shops. They were North Melbourne football supporters and
that explains it all.
Would scale fences of the football ground to break into games, which I think is pretty amazing when you've only got one leg to be climbing over these high fences. But they were considered the biggest larrikin menace at the turn of the 20th century. And what I love about Australia is its sense of inclusiveness, that we have embraced a differently abled larrikin gang and have provided, the opportunities for people of all sorts of different classes and abilities to join the criminal underworld. But look, no, they were seen as a menace, and it wasn't until the late 1920s when larrikins actually stopped taking bicycle chains and knives and guns to fights after various police crackdowns, that the image was rehabilitated and they came to be seen as just sort of knockabout blokes with the occasional donna, as larrikin women were known as, from the Portuguese or Spanish dona. Now everybody loves a larrikin.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing transformation through their history. I mean, it's quite sort of benign word now. You think, someone's a larrikin, a bit of a jokester, like
that. They're a bit of a jokester. I think larrikin was probably originally a word from a Warwickshire dialect that meant basically disaffected youth. And it appealed to them as well. It suggested, because leery was flash language for being a bit naughty, being good-naturedly criminal, and kin obviously had a connotation of social connection. Yep. So the idea of being a little bit naughty in a group of people, the name also fit within that context.
Speaking of larrikins, these were not larrikins. These are, maybe you think they are. Our Federation founders, who you write about in your third book in your Girt series, are a fascinating cast of people. We've done podcasts on the key ones, on Henry Parkes, on Alfred Deakin, Edmund Barton and George Reed. And in your book, you really make Alfred Deakin the sort of leading light, and why wouldn't you? He's such a colourful figure, and he really is, I think, for a writer, for an author, he is great material.
You can insert him into a story about almost anything that was going on in Australian history. So that's why I chose him as the sort of narrative backbone for Girt Nation, my third book. What I would say is that it wasn't just Deakin's, shall we say, colourful and varied interests, eccentricities is perhaps a polite way of describing them, that made him interesting. What's so important about Deakin is just about everything that we value in modern democratic Australia. Deakin had his fingers in making it happen. So his first ever speech was about women's rights. As a Victorian politician, he introduced some of the world's first workers' safety laws in factories. He was instrumental in setting up the separation of powers we have here today with an independent High Court. He was instrumental in setting up industrial arbitration laws where enterprise and unions would bargain for workers' rights. That was really a world first, and the rest of the world looked at the way that we were dealing with those sorts of issues. Introduced the age pension, the disability pension, the living wage. All of these things are seen to underpin egalitarian Australian society. So I think there's no more important politician in Australian history than Alfred Deakin in terms of crafting what I regard as a society that has the best guardrails to protect democracy and equality of anywhere in the world. And a lot of that has to be laid at the feet of Deakin.
I guess for a writer, though, it's his interests that make him such a fabulous protagonist. I mean, he was a crazy loon. he was mad as a cat snake. Deakin was the president of the Victorian Association of Progressive Spiritualists when he first entered the Victorian political scene. Not to put too fine a point on it, he believed he could talk to the dead. He took his first ever advice as a politician from Victorian Premier Richard Heale, who'd been 16 or 17 years in the coffin at the time that he started offering Deakin his pearls of wisdom. Deakin believed that he had conversations with Prince Albert, the dead consort to Queen Victoria, who informed him of the state of Anglo-Irish affairs. Deakin took stock tips, share tips from a dead Ballarat accountant. Now, it's fair to put that in context that at the time, outside New York, Victoria and Melbourne in particular was the epicentre of spiritualism anywhere in the world. Yeah, so this wasn't a totally out there thing to be involved in.
And it was popular amongst the legal community and members of the medical community.
And I mean, you just think of all those Agatha Christie novels where they've got the spooky scene with a seance and the Ouija board. I mean, this was the type of thing in the early 20th century that people were into.
Well, Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle was a spiritualist. Marconi, the scientist, was a spiritualist who hoped that, the radio waves he was pioneering would one day enable to communicate with the other side. I think Marie Curie was a spiritualist. The reason why you have lawyers, scientists and doctors embracing spiritualism is there was a rejection of the old sort of Christianity, the idea of a God who was infallible, knew everything. Biblical literalism had broken down with, geology saying the earth is more than, 4,000 odd years old, theory of evolution, the idea that things changed. These made people question the Bible. And spiritualism was seen as almost like a physical science where the dead, banged tables, moved cups on Ouija boards, produced ectoplasmic goo, played eerie trumpets. And so this was a form of spirituality with a physical manifestation. And that appealed to scientists and rational people, even though, of course, all of the people producing the ectoplasmic goo and the eerie trumpet noises were complete fraudsters.
You think he genuinely believed
that
he was conversing with, say, John Bunyan or, yeah.
No doubt. And Deakin translated for the spirit of John Bunyan a sequel to the Pilgrim's Progress called The New Pilgrim's Progress, which didn't sell nearly as well as the first. And he was convinced that Bunyan possessed his hand on 17 occasions to write this spectacularly unsuccessful and poorly written text, which I've read. And so his belief was genuine, and it's really interesting the way that spiritualism involved collectives of people, and so there's this mutual reinforcement of belief, as there is with any sort of religion, I think. So there was this sort of, in inverted commas, hysteria where people were prepared to believe things that today seem unbelievable. And of course, he wasn't the only Australian politician who dabbled with spiritualism. Thomas Walker, I think one of the most interesting politicians that we've produced, was a child preacher in northern England. He could recite basically the entire Bible. He moved to Canada and got involved in travelling shows as a spiritual medium, and actually fled Canada after a séance that he'd organised where he used phosphorus to produce sort of eerie lights, came into contact with one of the participants and burnt them to death. So he fled Canada whilst up for murder charges and chose to settle in Victoria.
As you do.
As you do. Where Deakin introduced him to polite society with a series of lectures where Walker claimed to be channeling the spirit of Giordano Bruno, after whom 2GB is named after the radio station. Basically an Italian heretic monk from the 1600s, and he would give these lectures as Bruno. What's interesting about Walker is that he later announced that it was all a fraud. He went on to found the first Skeptics Society in Australia. He became a New South Wales politician. He was the leading Republican in New South Wales in the 1890s. Whilst a politician, he regrettably shot a clergyman whilst drunk on the streets of Sydney's Redfern.
Yeah, he had form, this guy.
He had form. He avoided jail sentence when the Reverend forgave him, and he became a teetotaler and then campaigned around Australia and New Zealand as an abstinence campaigner. He settled in Western Australia, becomes the editor of the leading newspaper, joins the Western Australian House of Parliament, becomes Minister for Education and later Attorney-General and Speaker of the House. Now, all of this is an incredibly rich career for somebody who'd burnt somebody to death in a séance decades earlier.
He was a self-described fraudster.
It just goes to show that Australia was a place that you could reinvent yourself and make something yourself.
Well, my grandfather, Alexander Downer, who was a politician from 1949 until the early 60s, he was also very interested in spiritualism and had bookshelves full of spiritualist texts.
Yeah.
I never knew him, so I never got to discuss this, but it just goes to show, it really captivated serious people's minds and fraudsters' minds.
And Deakin himself was interested in all forms of religion. He wrote really impressive books on Hinduism and Islam. He became, just before he became Prime Minister in the late 1890s, he opened the first Theosophist Lodge in Melbourne, and they were an offshoot of the spiritualists who followed the Ukrainian occultist Madame Blavatsky. They believed that everything in the universe was dictated by the number 7. There were 7 intelligent rays of light known as the Diane Cohens, who infused the universe with a cosmic life force known as Fohat. So by this stage, Deakin had, really reached the jump up and down on the couch Tom Cruise stage of his spiritual journey. and despite that, just 8 years after that, he becomes the Prime Minister of Australia.
Yeah, well, as you've said before, and I'm sure we'll keep saying, it's a country to reinvent yourself in.
Indeed.
I mean, the fathers of our federation, they were all fathers. They are a fascinating.
Well, Catherine Helen Spence, you've got to credit Catherine Helen Spence.
Yeah.
She never held elected office, but she was hugely influential.
Yes, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I stand corrected. Fathers and some mothers, they are incredibly interesting individuals. But again, Federation as a story is often taught as a bit of a snooze fest, isn't it?
Yeah, look, there's nothing sexy about a constitutional convention. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. In fact, when I told my publisher I wanted to write about federation, I got the politely raised eyebrow. How will you be able to make that funny? But look, it was incredibly important, and people like Deakin, more than anyone, contributed to federation, particularly with the backing of the Australian Natives Association. He really tapped into sort of the grassroots federation movement. Henry Parkes portrayed himself as the grizzled old father of federation, even though people like Charles Gavin Duffy, the Irish land reformer and one-time Victorian minister, had been wanting to federate since the 1850s. Parkes, as he did for everything, took all the credit for it. Barton, I've always regarded as Barton as something of a show pony, perhaps lacking in substance and gravitas.
That's a very interesting interpretation, because I did do a podcast on Barton a few episodes before we'll release this one. And he was described as someone who really had very little aspirations of greatness for himself, and hadn't ever really intended to be Prime Minister or really even go into politics. Obviously with the unfortunate nickname Toby Tosspot, the bulletin.
Yeah, well, which it.
But, he wasn't necessarily, in this description at least, someone who thought himself above all others, but he worked really hard at the Federation project and went around New South Wales arguing the case.
I don't think he did think himself about others. This is the way that Deakin described him. Deakin also was into phrenology, of course,
Of course he was.
And he applied phrenological principles in writing about Barton. He described him as having eyes of remarkable beauty and expression, glowing like jewels in the ardour of his inspiration, but a fish-like mouth and large jaw, pointing not only to strength of will, but love of ease and indulgence. Hence the name Toby Tosspot. Barton would like to drink.
He did.
What Barton was, I think he skated across the surface of things. He was popular, he was likeable, he had a great sporting pedigree. He actually umpired the first English cricket tour of Australia, the game involving the English one against the New South Wales team. He was a good-looking, charismatic sort of bloke. He didn't think himself above people, and the strength of the Barton cabinet, I think, along with the strength of the Menzies and the Hawke cabinets, is he recognised the competence of others and relied on the competence of ministers to run their own portfolios. So Deakin had free rein to sort of run around doing a lot of the detail as Attorney-General, whilst Barton enjoyed port from the wine cellar under Melbourne's Parliament House, which is where the Parliament was set up. So I think Barton's likeability enabled him to sort of manage the conventions with a light touch, but I don't think he was a serious policy person.
But he had Deakin to fix all that for him.
He had Deakin, he had Griffiths, he had others.
In terms of phrenology, Robert Menzies' career, one could argue, was down to the actions of a phrenologist. He was a phrenologist who visited Little Japarut in the late 19th century, wasn't it? And massaged his scalp.
The boy has the skull of a Prime Minister.
No, a barrister.
A barrister, yes.
Didn't want to get ahead of himself. No. Anyway, and so he went on to be and then on to politics. So phrenology was useful, a lost art, I say. Now, David, another curious thing about Australia is that according to at least the British English-speaking world, we misspell Labor in the Labor Party. And, I often correct youngsters who put an errant U in there and say, no, it's, Labor, not Labor. But why is this? I think that is, it's worth asking. Has Labor got it wrong after all this time?
Well, Labor spent a solid 65 years arguing about it. They'd had branch meetings where they'd argue, should we use the U or should we drop it? And it traces back to the American Mr. Webster, the originator of the Merriam-Webster dictionary, who led the rational spelling movement in America. And he regarded all sorts of vowels in English as superfluous. So the Americans started cutting letters from words. They were seen by the Labor movement, some of these British influence words, similarly as ostentatious. So why not, spell a word more like it sounded like? That's what we working folk are into. Joseph Cook, who was actually leader of the Labor Party in New South Wales, in solidarity, comrades, dropped the E from his surname. So Joseph Cook with an E became Joseph Cook without an E, as part of the same tradition of writing more like a working man would write, which of course was the American way. And so after much internal party debate at a national level and then at local levels, I think the Balmain branch didn't accept the rational spelling until 1945. There were many heated debates as to the way the Labor Party should spell its name. Arguably, they spent more time arguing about that and less time spent arguing about policy. But, who am I to cast stones?
Well, I guess the fact that they were arguing about that and had I think you call it the Great Labor Spelling Split,
yes,
perhaps augured pretty badly for future splits that they would have as well.
Indeed.
But anyway, luckily for them and their parliamentary fortunes, they sorted all that out. David, another thing you write about is suffrage in Australia, and that was an evolving concept. I mean, we are proud that Australia was one of the first places in the world where women got the vote, and I'm originally from South Australia, and that was one of the first places in the world as well, where way before Australia even existed, but of course beaten only by New Zealand, I think, where women got the vote.
Women got the vote a year earlier in New Zealand, but it's a little known fact that in some of the United States, like Utah being one, and there was one other in the 1880s, women were granted suffrage. They had it, of course, taken away from them soon after. But we do like to sort of credit ourselves with being early adopters, and we were. We weren't the earliest. We were the first place in the world where women could not only vote but could run for elected office. And so that was the case in South Australia in 1894. And the reason for that, even the suffragists had not proposed that. It was not something that was on their card, but the Conservatives in Parliament moved an amendment to try and stop the bill from being passed by tacking on the fact that women could not only vote, they could run for office, thinking that would cause an outrage and they would spike the bill. It didn't. The bill ended up getting up, but entirely as far as the suffragists were concerned by happy circumstance rather than grand design.
So the Conservatives were too clever by half.
They were indeed.
And Queen Victoria who was Queen at the time and one of these colonies down and what would become Australia, she wasn't very happy about this development at all. Despite being a monarch and an all-powerful
arguably the most powerful person in the world, incredibly influential, incredibly powerful. And I think I say that she saw her female subjects as objects. She referred in a letter to a friend as this mad, wicked folly of women's rights, saying that Lady Amberley, the mother of Bertrand Russell and a champion of women's rights, ought to have a good whipping for her proposals that women be allowed to work in the medical profession and other areas.
Nothing like a bit of corporal punishment to deal with errant subjects.
And then she referred to women as the poor, feeble sex. She was in no way a champion of women's rights. What's interesting is that women's rights actually got off to a really early start in Australia. And part of that is having a 7-to-1 male to female ratio in the early days of the colony, where women were able to select, if you like, a partner from a level of society to get social advancement through marriage and relationships. Women were also able to end up owning property in Australia that would have been owned entirely by their husband in Britain, because at the time a woman was merely an extension of her husband legally. If the husband died, there often weren't male relatives around to inherit, so the woman earned the fortune. And if the husband was off overseas doing business in Britain, in the case of somebody like Elizabeth MacArthur, she ended up running the family business. Again, in Britain, there would have been some male relative to step in and do that. So women were more, Elizabeth Macquarie was the first female bank director in the world. And so I think there was an acceptance of women having broader roles in Australia than existed at the time in Britain. And so it's Australia where you see groundbreaking reforms such as the abolition of the Married Women's Property Act, which allowed married women to own their own property. Louisa Lawson, Henry Lawson's mum, championed divorce law reform, which gave New South Wales and later the other Australian colonies the most progressive divorce laws in the world from a female perspective, raised the age of consent. The women's suffrage movement was informed by, unlike Britain, it wasn't, the Pankhursts who were at the top of society. It was often concerned middle-class women or trade union women who allied together to push for social reforms. And when men ignored those calls for social reform, they realised that the only way to pursue women's rights was to give women a vote. And so we adopted suffrage. I think Victoria was the last place in 1908 to come into line, but by then there was the women's vote in every Australian jurisdiction. I think it was still, the 1920s when Britain and America followed suit.
It's interesting how necessity and scarcity are the greatest promoters or drivers of women's rights. You see that obviously through the 19th century in Australia, but even during the World War.
Exactly.
The men went off to...
And the women did these jobs.
Yeah, Europe, Middle East. Yeah, the women are at home doing these jobs, proving themselves. And then you get to sort of end of World War II and it's like, well...
Back into the kitchen, darling.
Yeah.
Yep.
No thanks.
Yeah.
I'm useful, I'm skilled, and I deserve to pursue that career or not just be in the kitchen. David, I thought we would finish off our discussion by hearing your reflections on how we balance this sort of view of amazing Australian democratic achievement while at the same time acknowledging that there have been mistakes made in obviously our white settlement journey since the 18th century, that there are people, First Nations people, of course, have experienced the most loss through white settlement, but also have, of course, been huge contributors to the development of Australia since white settlement as well. And more and more so today we acknowledge those contributions much more proudly and outwardly. But how do you balance those two conflicting stories in our history, do you think?
Well, first of all, I think you have to acknowledge that there are two stories or more than two stories in history. Until the 1970s, history was written as a grand narrative of the white man's progress of mastering, his environment. And we talk about the bush myth, I suppose, which was very much part of that grand nationalist history of people going out, setting up sheep runs, raising cattle, growing wheat. And one of the fascinating things about the bush myth itself is it was a myth. I mean, Australia was actually the most urbanised place on earth when the bush myth evolved. And every mild-mannered Sydney accountant, wore an akuba and conceived themselves as the man from Snowy River, because there was this idea that Australia was a bush society. And that informed the way that we wrote our history. Bill Stanner in the Boyer Lectures in, I think, 1968 referred to the Great Australian Silence of the way that Australian history had completely ignored, marginalised, not discussed First Nations people. And I think now we've progressed and matured as a nation, and now that is very much part of the discussion, thanks to historians like Henry Reynolds and Andrew Marcus and others. So the first thing in terms of understanding the complexity of Australian history is to acknowledge that there isn't one grand narrative, that there are multiple ways of viewing what's happened in Australia. And obviously, if you're a First Nations person, you are likely to have a very, very different history of Australia, or a perception of that history, than somebody like me who, went to a good school on Sydney's North Shore. So I think it's the conversation that we need to have with First Nations people. I think that's a continuing conversation, and it's not a conversation that will ever end, I don't think, because I think there will always be more than one Australia. There will never be all Australians regarding themselves as, equal. We emphasise egalitarianism, but at the same time, the One Australia policy was the most brutal immigration restriction policy anywhere in the world that, ran effectively for 72 years, or in its hardcore form for 4 or 5 decades. The marginalisation of Aboriginal history also suggests that in this search for an Australian egalitarianism that we believe that we have, the easy way to say that we're all equal is to ignore or marginalise those people we think aren't. And I think the One Australia policy was a manifestation of that. We wanted an equal society, but we didn't believe that Asians could be part of it. The solution, don't let the Asians in. Similarly with Aboriginal people, there's a discomfort there. I was born in 1971. Well, until 1973, the principal of a New South Wales public school could expel an Aboriginal student where the parents of other students complained about their presence. That's within my lifetime. So I think these are ongoing conversations that not just historians will have, but that all Australians will have.
I think all you've said is very true. I wonder, though, if we recognise the failings of the past but also the aspiration of the future, that Australia is a country that aspires to equality, a better iteration of equality. And yes, our past iterations don't match the standards of today. But the fact that there was that aspiration, even in the 19th century, even when we discounted, we didn't count those we didn't think were equal in the kind of bucket of who should be equal and who we want to, I guess, conceive of as our society. But there is that effort to do better, which I think is a wonderful Australian value and virtue, I would say.
I agree. And I think in this sense, what's commonly referred to the history wars have been very unhelpful because it's attempted to force people into binary camps. Black armband, everything was a bit shit. 3 cheers, everything was great. Those binary views don't hold up, and history and society are obviously more nuanced, and the truth is obviously somewhere in the middle. And, John Howard was right in saying that we should acknowledge the successes of Australian history. We should acknowledge the good things. Again, you also have to acknowledge what we would today regard as, in inverted commas, bad things. And as long as we have a respectful debate that doesn't attempt to paint people into one corner or the other, I think we can pursue that Australian vision of egalitarianism because it's a worthwhile vision to pursue.
I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. David Hunt, thank you for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's been a great discussion.
Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.